This episode, I'm joined once again by writer and occultist John Michael Greer to discuss his book, The Wealth of Nature, Economics as if Survival Mattered, alongside discussions on economics, the free market, consumerism, peak oil, and more. I'd like to say a big thank you to all my paid patrons and subscribers for making all of this work possible. And if you would like to support the podcast and keep it going indefinitely, please find links in the description below. Otherwise, please enjoy. So, John Michael Greer, thanks once again for joining us on Hermitix podcast.
Well, thank you for having me on again.
We are going to be discussing a book of yours, but more so probably just a topic. So the book we're discussing is The Wealth of Nature, Economics as if Survival Mattered, which was published by New Society Publishers in May 2011, but probably getting republished sometime in the near future. We may get into that.
Oh, it is getting republished. Okay. Yes, Founders House will have a new edition out in this year. Probably this summer. Being a small press, it's not hampered by some of the sort of process that makes big publishers so slow. And so, they're in the final stages of bringing out the Ecotechnic Future, which was another book of mine that New Society had and then let go of. And so The Wealth of Nature will be available shortly. I will be making an announcement on my Dreamwith journal to let everyone know.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. But sort of, I guess, more we will just be talking about the topic, which really isn't, and I don't mean this personally to either of us, but I mean, isn't all that fun to talk about? I know from experience, isn't fun to write about, and is probably the I'd best call it a pastime, which is rife with the most errors, which is economics, right? Now,
the dismal science.
The dismal science. Oh God, I have to do the economics section of this thing I'm writing, which is, the bit you always leave to last. So I'll get this question out of the way, which I think is a two-part question, which is the same question really, which is, one, what is economics commonly considered to be? And two, what do you think economics actually is?
Okay. Economics. The thing is, there are 3 or 4 different ways to answer that, and some of them are pretty snarky. So we can start with that one. Economics claims to be a science. It claims to be the science of how wealth is created, distributed, and transferred in any society, especially ours. It claims to be impartial. It claims to be objective. It is none of these things, as it currently exists. The problem with economics is that it's one of those studies that can almost never be honest, especially economics. Because when you talk about economics, as when you talk about political science, as when you talk about sociology, what you're really talking about is power. You're talking about who has the power to do what, who has the power to deny other people the right to do something. You're talking about who gets the money and who gets the shaft. And those are in every society that has a distribution of wealth at all, basically any society beyond the hunter-gatherer level, that's going to be a loaded issue. Because there's always going to be fraud. There's always going to be abuses of power. There's always going to be some people who get things they don't deserve and some people who deserve things they don't get. And if you want to make a comfortable living as a professor of economics or as a writer of books on economics or as an economist, you had better not mention these things because the people who are hiring you are by and large the people who are benefiting from the existing system. So, by and large, if you make a stack of books on economics, you're looking at a spectacular collection of palpable lies and of total nonsense. And the value of economics is that sometimes you can look past that. You can look past the hand-waving and past the transparent attempts to justify plunder of one form or another and see the actual patterns at work. And so we can say that what economics claims to be is an objective science of wealth and its peregrinations, what economics is usually in practice is a form of propaganda justifying the existing order or justifying somebody else's claims to a bigger share of the pie. And that, of course, that's the thing that makes all of this so difficult because, when you're dealing with a situation where next to nobody is telling the truth, it's very difficult to kind of dig your way through it.
So in that sense, then, what is the economy? Just so we have these two terms, somewhat defined before we go in.
Okay. And here again, there's what the economy is considered and what the economy is. What the economy is considered to be is the set of structures in a human society that produces and distributes various forms of wealth. Wealth meaning here anything that people value. Whatever. An electronic Billy Bass that twitches its head and tail and sings songs off key is wealth to somebody who actually wants one. I have no idea who these people are, but these things are made and sold. So clearly, clearly that's wealth for somebody. Now, that's what economy is understood as, and that's actually a little more accurate than some things you'll find. What the economy actually is a dependency on nature. Everything in the economic world is dependent on nature. And so the economy is a way in which human beings take certain streams of energy and resources out of the natural world and put them to their own use. If you understand that, you understand something that most economists miss completely. And it's something that's absolutely crucial to understand the situation we're in as a species, as society, and as individuals.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, it's well known now. I mean, you've mentioned it quite a few times on this podcast that politically you're sort of closest aligned with a Burkean conservatism. That's correct. Is there an economic system or school that you would say that you're closest to?
Yes, and that adds a certain amount of humor to the whole thing because the economics that I'm most closely aligned to tends to be more associated with the other end of the political spectrum, and that is the economics of E.F. Schumacher, author of Small is Beautiful and a variety of other works. He's the inventor of the concept of intermediate technology, and the essays of his that were combined in his book Small is Beautiful were the inspiration for this book of mine, and more generally. Now, if this does not sound like a conservative point of view, there's a lot of people who use the word conservative these days, and they use it very, very loosely. If somebody is going to call themselves conservatives, I want to know what they think they're conserving. Mm-hmm. Because certainly I don't follow the vagaries of the political scene in Britain anything like as much as I do here in the United States, since I have to deal with it more directly. But here we have an enormous number of people who call themselves conservatives who literally don't seem to have conserved anything in their lives.
Ours are the same. Ours are the same.
Yeah, well, there we go. It's all. Industry should have the right to waste, to lay waste to everything, including human lives, as long as they make large profits. This is not a conservative point of view. A conservative point of view says, okay, what are the good things about the situation that we now have? How can we sustain them? What are the good things about the situation we had in the recent past that have been lost due to idiotic policies? How can we regain them? And so, for this reason, a genuine Burkean conservative looks at the economic situation that we're in, the claims that are being made about the economy, and little things like how do people support themselves? How do people provide themselves with goods and services that they need? And what are the examples where this has been done in an intelligent way, a sustainable way, a conservative way, a way that conserves? And how can we maximize that and minimize sheer waste just so that some blowhard in a corner office somewhere can point to an abstract number and say, we made this big of a profit?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Of course, the irony is, and I mean, I've finished rereading Burke's Considerations on the Revolution in France a couple of months ago. The irony is that those people who consider him these days, at least, or Burkean conservatism these days, hit Burke as this sort of cornerstone of the far right, which I don't really think is entirely true. Maybe you'll disagree with me.
No,
actually, when you read that, and if I read his biography, which was written by Jesse Norman as well, he was extremely liberal for his day, extremely liberal. And I don't think he's really anything to do with what people consider "quote unquote" far right, whatever that is. So.
No. The extent that the far right has antecedents, you find them in continental conservatism, not in the Anglo-American tradition. It's very much the Joseph Le Maistre kind of people. The idea that there is a divine order to the world, and we must drag people back to it. And this was a concept that would have made Burke roll his eyes. His point of view was simply that history tells us what will more or less function. And, we have some examples, we have some evidence, we have this experience that has shown us that these things work and these things don't. And so when some radical comes charging and saying, no, we have to change everything to fit this crackpot idea I've just come up with, the appropriate thing to do is said, that's very nice. Now, test it or give us some evidence that this won't be the complete disaster that we all know that it will. And unfortunately, a lot of what happened to conservatism in the Anglo-American world, in the English-speaking world generally, is that after so many years of facing off against the Marxists, who have their ideology, who have their vision of a perfect society, an embarrassing number of conservatives have become a kind of a reflection of Marxism. They've got their ideology. They've got their free market utopia, and they insist on ramming that down people's throats, whether it works or not. And of course it doesn't. We know from centuries of brutal experience that if you let the free market run amok, it does in fact run amok, and you end up with the kind of conditions for the working poor that gave rise to the adjective Dickensian. Okay, so that's already been tried. We know it doesn't work. A conservative approach would conserve the things that do work, which is an economy under reasonable but not extreme government regulation, and the provision of a basic social safety net. These things work. We've seen that they work. They got rid of some of the ugliest slums on the planet, both in your country and in mine, and a genuinely conservative viewpoint would look at that and say, okay, now. So that's a gain. We know that works. And here are some other things that were done along the same lines that didn't work. Okay, jettison those. But try getting that across to people who have convinced themselves that the way to be political is to adopt some kind of crackpot utopian ideology and ram it down people's throats.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, so there's two things there. I mean, one is probably just a personal point, which we don't have to touch on, but because I'm a huge fan of his writings, I would enjoy maybe a brief comment on your opinion of Joseph de Maistre.
I would have to go back and it's been long enough since I've reread him, or since I've read him in the first place, and generally I would have to go back and do a lot of rereading of the continental conservative tradition. I may have misunderstood it. Most of what I see is its echoes in much later writers. For example, the capital T traditionalists, who I've had some reason to study of late.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay. Are you on about like Guénon and these figures?
Guénon and Evola and Friedrich Schuon and so on. Yeah. In the other side of my work, in the esoteric and occult side of my work, there's a steady drumbeat of people who are very interested in the traditionalists, and so I'm constantly being asked questions. Well, what do you think about what Evola said about this? What do you think about what Guénon said about that? And so. You can't really, unless you just want to roll your eyes and walk away, which isn't really constructive. If you're in my business, you have to be conversant with their ideas.
Okay. Maybe they'll come back in somehow. We'll see. But jumping back to the free market, so the fact that certain limitations allowed us to not descend into, as you say, a sort of a Dickensian split of wealth so severe that there's slums and there is sort of aristocracy, etc. What would you make of those people who say that, we have on one side, we have those who say real communism has never been tried, and I would, of course, argue absolutely it has. But on the other side, we also have those who say real capitalism hasn't been tried. The free market hasn't been truly freed. Do you think there's any truth to that?
No. Adam Smith explained why that's not true in the pages of the Wealth of Nations. He pointed out that whenever people in the same business get together, even for a social event, you can be absolutely sure they're going to plot some way to rip off the public. Mm-hmm. There is no such thing as a free market because there cannot be such a thing as a free market, because you could do it I suppose if there is an economy in heaven staffed entirely by angels, you might have an actually free market. But the first job of any capitalist in any market system whatsoever is to replace the free market with an oligopoly or a monopoly, at which point it stops being free. It becomes a situation where producers control the economy and jack up prices as far as they want. So the free market is like anarchist politics. It's this ideal condition which simply doesn't work in practice because there's no way to prevent it from being abused. It's subject precisely to Garrett Hardin's Tragedy of the Commons. Mm-hmm. And so that's exactly the problem. In the sort of Dickensian 19th century version of capitalism, where there were very, very few controls over the power of the rich, the capitalists, to abuse the working classes and so on, you had that abuse of power as a constant feature. You did not have a situation where individual laborers could bargain on an equal basis with the people who offered them jobs, because the people who offered them jobs could leave them to starve, or call in government troops or strike breakers from private corporations to beat them up and kill them if they got out of line. So you immediately go from this fantasy of a free market to a reality of coercion and violence and exploitation. Doesn't work. Anytime anybody says X has not been tried, you can basically assume that they're shoveling smoke. Because almost certainly what happens is that X has been tried and it failed repeatedly. And so they're trying to say, these policies have never achieved the goal they were trying to. The free market capitalist society of our dreams, the communist society of our dreams, pure democracy. There are many different things. And that's because these are unattainable utopian fantasies. And so so you can't try them in a sense that would satisfy the people who think they want these things.
So anarcho-capitalists are doubly silly.
Every anarcho-capitalist I've ever met desperately wanted to be one of the very, very rich people riding roughshod over everyone else. Now, they may not have admitted that publicly, but if you get, share a few beers and get them talking, and pretty soon it's very clear that their idea is that anarcho-capitalism is their way to become insanely rich, do whatever they want, and stomp everyone else into the mud.
Okay. So
that's been my experience. I could, your mileage may vary, but that's been my experience.
No, yeah, I can sympathize. There's a sort of undertow of greed and a yearning for a system which allows greater greed.
Yeah, which allows completely unchecked greed and exploitation. Yeah, exactly. And
the irony that I always found with anarcho-capitalists as well is that the anarcho part gets sort of overshot in the sense, or overlooked in the sense that as soon as they're within that system, absolutely everything is abiding by even more laws.
Of course.
So you're going from the state laws, which admittedly some of them might not be so good, but then you end up in this world of just, I don't know, it just seems hellish in terms of laws and restrictions.
Of private laws, which is actually if you take the Latin verb that's the word privilege, privilege. Privilege is a system of private laws that apply to some people and not to others. And so anarcho-capitalism the anarcho is hand-waving. Because what will happen immediately thereafter is, as soon as some people get vastly more wealth than others, their word becomes law for all practical purposes, and then we're basically back in the Middle Ages.
But there does seem to be some value in the roots of that tradition in terms of the Austrian school. You already mentioned this idea of value in terms of, we've spoken before about the dancing Santa Claus animatronic thing, or the sea bass that you screw to the wall and press and it sings. There is abiding by other systems such as Keynesian or Marxist, that those things are either related to abstract price or value, whereas at least in the Austrian tradition, they admit what you admitted there at the start, which is value is subjective.
It's one of the great things. I mean, the Austrian system has its problems. By the terms I mentioned earlier, you can assume that every system of economics is either propaganda for the existing order or propaganda for people who want a bigger cut of the pie. But to the extent that the Austrian school has stressed the fact that value is not an abstraction is not an objective quality of anything. It purely is a way of referring to the fact that people want something.
Mm-hmm.
For example, for most of us, a piece of underwear belonging to a pop star has no value. But I promise to the fans of that pop star, that thing has immense value. You can't, and you're right, you cannot fit that into a Keynesian or a Marxist viewpoint. You just have to accept the fact that, people want what they want and they're willing to give other things in exchange to get it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So in what sense have economic predictions ever helped? Is it just simply a way to bolster that personal bias?
Well, the major thing about economic predictions, whether they help is one thing, and they do in a certain wry roundabout sense, which I'll get to. But the most consistent thing about economic predictions is that they're wrong. The running joke after the housing crash in 2008, 2009 was, what do you call an economist who expresses an opinion? Wrong. And it was true. Let's see, who was it? I think it was Nassim Nouriel Roubini, the author of The Black Swan and various other good books, who was saying that he'd several times given speeches to rooms full of economists talking about how this was an obvious speculative bubble, that it was going to go up and pop and crash in the usual way, and they were all looking at him as though he had sprouted 2 extra heads. Now, in point of fact, it was screechingly obvious to anybody but an economist, or the people who believed them, that the housing bubble was a bubble. It was behaving exactly like a bubble. There were people all over the internet. Keith Brand's Housing Panic blog was the one that I watched most carefully. It had tens of thousands of readers who were all agreeing, oh my God, this is the total bubble. It's going to crash sometime very soon. Property values are going to plunge. Millions of people are going to be ruined. And every single day, you had people coming in there who claimed to have a background in economics and saying, no, that's not true. And it was hilarious. And this is not the only time this has happened. I remember it happening in the run-up to the 87 crash. I remember it happening in the run-up to the 1999-2000 tech stock crash. The only people who consistently fail to grasp the fact that a speculative bubble is happening are people with background in economics. So, in point of fact, an economics degree seems to make people stupid when it comes to the behavior of speculative markets. You can see this in many other contexts. And this does make economic prediction very useful in one kind of backhanded way. If you hear an economist saying this is going to happen, you know that it's not going to happen. If you hear an economist saying this rise in value is a perfectly healthy growth of a market, assume that it's a bubble. You will be right far more often than not. And I think it was Robert Heinlein, the science fiction writer, who said that if you want to make good decisions in an upcoming election and you don't have time to do the research, find a well-meaning fool, ask what he thinks, and then vote exactly the opposite way. And in this way, economists generally, especially not only, but especially in the macroeconomics field, economists are the well-meaning fools of the world of money. Find out what they're saying, do the opposite, and you'll thrive.
Reminds me of that joke, how do you know if a politician is lying? His lips are moving.
His lips are moving, exactly. Yeah. And it's a very similar situation. Because politicians, again, have absolutely no reason to tell the truth and every reason imaginable to shovel smoke. Their power, their position, their hopes of attaining a higher position later on all depend on convincing various power centers that they will benefit the said power centers more than the other clod. And so, shoveling smoke and handing out nonsense is part of that job. In a way, you can think of politicians as kind of the public relations agents of the status quo. Their job is to convince people that everything's okay, especially when it's not, and to convince people that their interests will be served by supporting this faction rather than that faction of the elite, even when the voters are going to get shafted either way.
But that's the thing for politicians. What they're saying, absolutely every single facet of their life rides on that. Their status, their power, their job, their income, everything. So once you're in that, once you have the power, which is really how the left works, which is give power to people who are disenfranchised, and they will do anything to cling to it.
Exactly.
Yeah, so there's no, as you say, there is absolutely no reason for them to not just pull out any stops to find any way to retain their power.
Well, it's Lord Acton's comment: power corrupts, and he's right, and you can see that in every political system.
But it's interesting what you say about people seeing bubbles. I always love watching. But I mean, the Bitcoin bubble in real time was very enjoyable, and I mean, I actually remember I before this chat a couple of days ago, I went back to the blog post on your. So what would that have been? That would have been December 2017, just before the first big crash. And I remember you posting something about people buying Bitcoin on credit and people wearing Bitcoin jumpers, and basically these absolute clear as day red flags. And this reminds me, and obviously, as you said at the time, every economist, even though what was in front of everyone's eyes was clear as day, what was going to happen next, it took, that certain collective agency to be able to manifest something which said otherwise, right? Which is what the economists were doing. But it reminds me of one of my favorite quotes, which I came across recently, and it's applied to basically just a whole host of situations. And it's from the mystic writer Alfred Orage, and he says, "The last degree of esoteric teaching is plain common sense." Which I think is absolutely perfect, right? You wade through the muck for years and years, studying everything, and eventually you get to the end and go, yeah, this was the stuff which your gut was telling you right at the beginning.
But you have to. But the thing is, common sense is a very uncommon acquisition, especially in an age of universal hand waving. There is not much common sense to be had these days, and so getting to the point where was it? Oh, the Discworld guy. I'm forgetting his name temporarily. Yes, Terry Pratchett. One of his witch characters had not the second but the first sight, which is the capacity to see what is actually in front of your face, which is an immense power that most people never achieve. So if esoteric training can get you to the point that you can actually see what's in front of your face and act in accordance with common sense, then it's accomplished miracles.
Quite literally. And to tie this back to economics, and I think it's very clear, we can speak of what is in front of our face. One truth, which is completely in front of all our faces in terms of economics, which is there is one form of currency. Energy. That is it. Energy.
Energy is the currency that matters. And everything else is a surrogate for it. Everything else is a kind of system of tokens, especially money. Economists get very strange about money. And in practice, you get people who think that if only we have enough money. I mean, the quantitative easing that's become such a dominant force in modern economic life these days. It's based on the idea that if only we have enough money, everything will be fine. It's very reminiscent of the joke about the Los Angeles type who's going, I can't be overdrawn on my checking account. I've still got checks left. And that's basically the attitude of quantitative easing. There are no problems we can't solve by flooding the market with money, and it's become addictive. And the fact that it has not caused hyperinflation is, I think, something we need to pay very close attention to, because what that shows is that money is going into the system, and so a significant amount of money must be hemorrhaging out of it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Could you expand on that, just for those who
sure.
might not know the complexities of what you're talking about?
Okay. Well, basically, to start with, there's a lot of hand-waving about inflation and so on, but what inflation is, too much money chasing too few products. When the money supply goes up, if the availability of goods and services doesn't go up to match, you have inflation, because people can charge more, and they will charge more. And so with quantitative easing, there's been an immense amount of money created by hand waving, created out of thin air by the electronic equivalent of spinning the presses. In the United States especially, there's fantastic quantities of money. Our government basically runs by funding its deficit by way of the printing press. And yet this is not now we're getting some significant inflation, but nothing like what you would expect from, what has it been, well over a decade now of gargantuan quantitative easing activities and the manufacture of money in gargantuan amounts. So that money must be leaving the economy at something like the pace that it was entering it, or you would have that. What is almost certainly happening here, what all the evidence suggests is happening, is that it's going into the illegal economy, and it's also being siphoned off into various people's pockets. The reason we have these godzillionaires who have their private space programs and so on is precisely that they are able to extract all this extra money from the economy. And the fact that all of these asset classes are soaring endlessly in price. These are ways that money is being pumped out of the economy into essentially worthless assets, paper, paper of this kind, paper of that kind, and being stashed there. Now, how long can it continue? We simply don't know. It has not happened in the past that this kind of thing has been developed with such complexity. The normal outcome sooner or later is that all those asset classes, a question of their value comes up, people start trying to sell, and down everything comes in a hurry. But we don't know yet. We simply don't know which way the current experiment is, to some extent, unprecedented, and we don't know what's going to happen. Do
you think there actually is anyone who knows, or do you think we've sort of rushed ourselves into such a complexity that we just go, right, emperor's new clothes situation?
Nobody can know. Because certainly we can come up with grandiose theories, and I'm sure if you go down to the economic departments of half a dozen universities in your country or mine, you can find at least 30 different theories as to exactly what that's going to do, all of which insist that it's a good thing because it makes the rich richer, whether they admit that that's what's going on or not. But as to, do we know what's going to happen? No, Socrates, we do not. We will simply have to wait and see. It has not been tried before. And as we have seen, the experts do not have a very good track record predicting the behavior of complex systems.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. But this is, so what seems to be happening then in the language that you use in your book is we are having a sort of battle between, we're hemorrhaging wealth for money.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, let's duck back and talk a little bit about the division in the book. What I talk about in the book is a division of three economies rather than one. There is the tertiary economy, which is what most people think about in terms of economics. It's money. The tertiary economy is things like inflation and deflation. It's what's the money supply like, how fast is money moving, all the things that economists track. Okay. The secondary economy is the economy of goods and services. The actual things that people use, not financial services or financial goods, but things like houses and teacups and getting somebody to come fix your plumbing, things like that. That's the secondary economy. And the primary economy is nature. The primary economy is sun and wind, soil and green things growing, water flowing into and out of hydroelectric dams, but not the dams themselves. Those are secondary economy. All the natural systems that make the secondary and tertiary economies possible are the primary economy. That's the real economy. The real economy is the environment. So what we have going on now, and what we had going on actually when I originally wrote The Wealth of Nature, is that the tertiary economy, the economy of money, has metastasized. It has become gargantuanly more complex, more heavily overloaded, more intrusive than in any previous civilization. In most human civilizations, most economic transactions have nothing to do with money. People make things and use them. That's an economic transaction. People make things and give them to people, or barter them, or there are gift economies, there are customary exchange economies. There are all these ways, there are household economies, that people can produce and consume goods and services that have nothing to do with money. One of the things that makes our situation so fascinating is that ours is the first civilization in known history to have tried to convert every economic activity into something for which you have to have money. Mm-hmm. And so what's been going on lately, the tertiary economy has not been doing well. The secondary economy is not doing well. It's become increasingly hard to get goods and services, to get goods and services of any quality, or in some cases at all. And so because economists have been trained to think that there's only one economy and it's money, the standard approach to that is, okay, we need to get more money into circulation, whether we're going to hand it out to banks, whether we're going to hand it out to people, whether we're going, all of these things. It's all flood the economy with money and that will fix everything. And it hasn't, and it's not going to. It's set in motion various imbalances of its own. In some cases, it's patched over things temporarily. But so we have this incredible amount of money. And here especially, as an American, I'm watching here the U.S. dollar, which is the de facto global currency. Most other central banks of other countries have gargantuan amounts of it. And there's a huge amount that's flowing here and there through various legal, semi-legal, and illegal economic exchanges. Your basic drug dealer is mostly taking money in U.S., and in U.S. currency. And that's all flowing to various places. It's going to London, it's going to Hong Kong, it's going to Singapore, where it can be laundered and sent elsewhere. So you have these gargantuan amounts of money, all of which claims to be a claim on goods and services. Because that's all money is. Money is a set of tokens that gives you a claim on a certain amount of goods and services. You have a 10-pound bill. That's worth a certain amount of goods or services. And yet the economy of goods and services is not in very good shape these days. And so there are real questions about, can those claims actually be honored? Especially, again, in the case of the U.S. currency. There's a lot of claims out there. How many of them can actually be honored? There's more money in circulation right now than there are goods and services in the world by several orders of magnitude. What's going to happen when any fraction of that starts trying to be cashed in? Life gets complicated.
There are those who are seeking to fix this problem. And I speak of Bitcoin, which actually I think we spoke about in our very first chat, however many years ago it was now. But this adheres to the same problem, right? Is that what's behind it is basically just a usage of limited fossil fuels. Yeah.
Well, the idea of the idea of having an independent currency that people use purely because they choose to use it, that in itself is not a bad idea. And the idea that it needs to be limited in some way so that you can't just produce as much of it as you want, that's also very sensible. But the fact that they've set it up so that Bitcoin mining is done by the mass consumption of fossil fuels, so you have factories all over Asia churning out coal smoke to produce Bitcoins, that's become one kind of source of disruption. Also, of course, once it started catching on, people wanted to speculate using it. People piled into it on the hopes that the price would go up. The price then went up. We probably still have a lot of downside ahead. It would not surprise me if Bitcoin were to go up further, possibly in one more gargantuan spike, possibly more than one, before it finally drops down to whatever its final level is going to be. But the idea of alternative of government independent alternative currencies is, I think, basically a good one. It's simply that one and some of the others now, of course, have become speculative vehicles, and that's going to involve some very dramatic wobbles.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. But then, I mean, that's not due to the actual sort of function of the currency itself. That's back into the fiat.
No, it's on the one hand, in the case of Bitcoin, on the one hand, it's because it's dependent on fossil fuels, and on the other hand, because it's become a speculative vehicle. The basic concept is, I think, as I said, potentially a good one.
Mm-hmm. So why?
Because the thing is, if you have a range of possible currencies available, then if one of them, like say the U.S. dollar, were to implode, you don't necessarily get left with all your eggs in one basket. Mm-hmm. And so, for that reason, I quite understand people who are trying to spread out their investments through a whole range of currencies. But go on.
Well, it leads to the big question, because it's across all currencies. Of course, is why do we ignore the primary economy, which is nature, in favor of the tertiary economy?
Well, I mean, the thing is that's hardwired into our Western culture at this point. The idea, the pervasive idea at the heart of our modern Western industrial culture is that nature is just a passive lump of stuff that is there for us to do whatever we want to with it. It can't possibly react. It can't possibly do something we don't tell it. There's this bizarre fixation on the individual ego as the only thing that can act, and everything else in the world must be passive to it. It's kind of the ideology of the really, really spoiled 5-year-old who goes into a shrieking tantrum when anything doesn't obey whatever said spoiled 5-year-old wants it to do. And so this is kind of hardwired into our culture these days. And this is actually something we see in issues of social class. And watching people in the managerial class deal with the fact, or rather desperately avoid dealing with the fact, that people in the working classes and the poor know perfectly well that they're being lied to and can't just be talked out of it. It's hilarious. I recall when there have been a whole series of studies over the last decade or so when they've taken a bunch of working class people and shown them a video meant to convince them of something, and the working class people come out and saying they're even more convinced that they're being lied to.
Yeah, that's fairly common with the working class.
Exactly, because they know better. Because they've been lied to by people in suits how many times? And so, yes, the working class, but the thought that that the working class might have learned from their experience is anathema to the managerial class. And so they have to come up with these complicated psychological theories to explain why people aren't doing what aren't being perfectly passive puppets in the face of this clueless and usually ham-fisted propaganda. It's very reminiscent back in the before the American Civil War. African American slaves in the South would attempt to run away and get across into the North and into Canada ultimately, so they could, in order to win their freedom. And in the South, you couldn't talk about that because it was absolutely required to believe that the slaves are perfectly happy being slaves. Of course, they weren't, but that was the propaganda. They couldn't possibly object to their treatment. Therefore, psychologists came up with this bizarre mental illness called drapetomania, which was the irrational compulsion to run away from home, which for some reason a lot of African-American slaves were afflicted by this strange mental compulsion. This is exactly the same logic that you're hearing from the managerial classes these days, trying to figure out why people are voting for the wrong person, quote, wrong person, unquote, why they're not listening to their soi-disant betters when said betters lecture them on what they ought to think.
But once again, we return to this peculiar thing we've spoken of before, which we'll probably never get to the root of it, but it's very interesting. This idea of the managerial class sort of saying, basically making it clear that there is a certain way people should be thinking and feeling and doing whatever. And yet, they do these surveys and ask all the questions, and when the evidence comes out completely in the opposite direction, they still don't alter anything in that direction, but somehow phrase it to seem absurd. 10 out of 20 people want this, and it's like, well, I mentioned in our last chat that the recent Guardian article of something like, more and more young men are returning to the church because it gives them meaning. And they phrased it as if this was some sort of crazy surprise, right? And this is quite a common thing, that blindingly obvious things to those who are in the common working class. And you go, well, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but you have to understand that there are two forces that make it impossible for the managerial classes to exercise the first sight and see what's right in front of their faces. The first is the conviction that they know the truth. Mm-hmm. That whatever their opinion happens to be, however cockamamie it might be, they know the truth, and anyone who disagrees with them is just plain wrong. That's central. That's not just an opinion. It's central to their identity. The managerial class, it has built its whole function as a modern aristocracy, which of course is what it is, around the idea that they know what to do. They know how to run things. They're the ones who know better. And so confront them with evidence that they don't know better, they can't process it because you're challenging the core of their identity as social beings. Mm-hmm. So there's that on the one hand, and there is this assumption of passivity on the part of everything outside the individual ego. And so, the working class can't possibly have looked at, these young men who are returning to the church. They can't possibly have listened to, the rantings of the various rationalist spokesflags and so on, and said, well, that really doesn't make any sense to me. And they can't actually have, visited a church and say, this makes me feel like there's more meaning to life. No, because people people outside the managerial class aren't supposed to have that capacity. They're passive objects to be moved about by us because we know how to do things. This is taught to them in the schools. It is taught to them in the universities. It's pervasive in their workplaces. It's the force that gives them meaning. And so to lose that, to suddenly realize that they don't know how the world works, that all they have are a bunch of theories that don't actually work that well, that they don't know how to run things. You're asking them to surrender the most basic conception of their being, and they won't do it. And so we have the kind of idiocies that we've been discussing.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And I think one other factor there is that the majority of working class people have a more direct connection to nature in the sense of economics that we've been talking about. This middle management, aristocracy, managerial class are sort of born and live and are subsumed into this mentality of the tertiary economics, spreadsheets, numbers, blah, blah, blah. Mm-hmm. Working class people, and I've been there myself, know what it is to have, this is my last money and I need to eat. And by that, you understand from that, you go, these are the things which are truly important in life. Oh, yeah. And it teaches you common sense very quickly.
Oh, yeah. Being poor is something that I recommend everybody should go through at least once in their lives. I had the huge advantage of going into a career as a writer. And, all those jokes about writers living in garrets and so on, it's true. The first 10 years of a writing career, you're going to be eating a lot of rice and beans because it's not until you get a good backlog of things in print that the money starts coming in. So, but I recommend it because if you are actually seriously poor enough that you have to budget if you want food on the table, then, common sense dawns. There was, this is getting back a ways, Timothy Leary of hallucinatory memory had a thing that he called the hydrodynamic theory of money, which is that money naturally flows wherever it's needed, and that if you need money, you just have to kind of be open to it and it will show up. And this is how you can tell that he was a member of the upper middle classes, that he was a child of privilege. Because I can tell you for a fact that the poor and the working people know perfectly well that no, money does not just show up because you want it. And yet, Leary spoke for a generation and a class who had gotten into that trip and who made a point of not noticing their own condition of privilege, of class privilege, which enabled them to get money whenever they needed it by simply, calling on their privilege. So, there are still people who are stuck in that rut.
Well, not to... well, I will ruffle feathers with this, but
go ahead.
To the boomer generation in generally are still mostly stuck in that. They don't realize they were in the anomaly in history. I remember working just a basic retail job when I was younger, and the job itself could only just about, working full time, could only just about afford me the basics of living. And that was sort of renting a room, in a shared house, where a woman I was working with had worked the same job as me since high school, and had, along with her husband, but had a 3-bedroom house, semi-detached house with 2 cars. Right? She couldn't see that it was nothing to do with work ethic or pulling up my bootstraps. Yeah. Something had gone wrong, which is, the big talking point at the moment, which is, why can't a single person household on a basic full-time job afford the necessities needed to live? And no one wants to deal with this, both in the UK and the US. No one wants to look that in the face. And
it is the most explosive question of our time, because the reason for it, of course, is that working class wages have been systematically driven down relative to the cost of living for the last 50 years. And it's been driven down. It's bipartisan. It's not that one party has driven it down and the other party has held it up. Both parties in both countries have smiled and nodded while the working classes will ground face first into the mud. And it is the most important political fact of our time. It is the one that nobody wants to touch, and that's one of the reasons that I keep on talking about it. Because there's a crucial point here having to do with actually the tertiary economy. You can't have a functioning consumer economy when too many of the consumers are too poor to buy anything. And so if you allow real estate prices to be driven up to insane levels so that nobody can afford to rent, or those who can are putting every spare penny they've got into rent, and therefore they can't afford to buy anything else except a little rice and beans to hold body and soul together. That looks really great if you own real estate, but it's a disaster for society as a whole. If real estate prices, if the various legal props that keep real estate prices inflated were to be pulled out, and real estate prices were to come down to a level compared to incomes as they were, say, in the 1950s or in the 1920s, then all of a sudden a lot of people would have much more money to spend and the consumer economy would thrive. But that would not be to the benefit of the interests of the classes that own real estate, and so they're not having any of it. And in the same way, you can apply the same thing across the board to every situation where wages have been driven down and prices have been driven up for the working classes. If the wages were allowed to rise, if the prices were allowed to follow, those working class people would happily go out and spend lots of money. They would happily go out and buy this and buy this product, buy that service, spend money on this, that, and the other thing. Businesses would thrive. You'd have an economic boom. But the people who've been benefiting from the current situation would have to take some hits, and they're not willing to do so.
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the exact problems we have in the UK at the moment, which is we have a huge demand for properties, massive demand, especially for young people for properties.
Yeah.
But the supply is controlled by those who have a monopoly, and any fluctuation in the prices, they don't want it because they control it, and they can also afford to just sit on it while there is no fluctuation in prices. Yeah. So it's basically buy it or don't have it, and it doesn't affect the people who already own it because they're so rich it doesn't matter.
Exactly. And this is, was it Henry George, I think, who had the single tax idea that the basic tax should be a tax on owning real estate. I think there were some problems with his theory, but he had some basic ideas, right, which is that control over land gives you disproportionate power over the economic situation and over wealth and over the political world, ultimately. So breaking that down so that more people have access to property ownership, and you don't have the same kind of gargantuan rentier class sitting on top of society, pumping it dry. But of course, politically that's very difficult. It can be done. It will probably be done. especially as we start seeing population. Because the world as a whole is very near its population peak. Europe, the United States would actually have declining population if not for immigration. And so, as population begins to contract, you're going to start seeing airspace open up in the real estate thing, and if that becomes enough of a political issue, I think some of the props can be pulled out from under real estate prices, and we can start seeing a reversion to less parasitic modes of economics.
Mm-hmm. I mean, just jumping back to one thing you said about the consumer society and purchases.
Mm-hmm.
And this is just anecdotal, perhaps it's something you've noticed as well, but in recent years, I remember when I was a young boy, a purchase such as a washing machine or a TV or, I don't know, a projector or something that was quite fancy, a PC, monitor or PC, that would have been a big purchase, and everything else, relatively, the things you needed were relatively affordable. But there seems to be a huge flip in recent years. I walk down the meat aisle, and especially in the UK, the prices are going up, and the portions are getting smaller per price. But then when I look online or elsewhere for consumer products, such as TVs, etc., they're insanely low. I'm not sure if something psychological is going on there, that perhaps it's sort of a paranoia on my part that I believe that people are trying to be controlled, but those types of things seem to be maddeningly cheap.
You see, I think that I don't think that's an accident at all. I think it's a very important sign to watch, because what that shows is that the demand for those things has dropped. What that shows is that more and more people are just saying, no, I think I'm going to get one that's used, or I'm not going to get one, because they can't afford it. And so you're seeing what used to be the high-end purchases having their prices forced down because nobody can afford them anymore. Whereas, people still need to eat. By the way, prices of meat here in the United States are also way up. Mm-hmm. And can be expected to go much higher now that we're having the drought all over the western two-thirds of the country, and that's most of our meat-producing regions, and a lot of people can't get water for their livestock.
I see. So what diet's coming next?
Well, good question. The one that I'm recommending to people is the old-fashioned way of living well when you're poor, which usually involves a lot of things like rice and beans with a little meat when you can get it.
Yeah, that seems about right.
I have to say, I thrived on such a diet. I still eat something much closer to an old-fashioned rural American working person's diet than I do to what I could, at least in theory, afford. Better for your health too. So one of those things.
Yeah, I grew up on one of those diets as well, so I still eat a lot of liver.
Well, there you go. Yeah,
crazy cheap, and it's the best cut for you.
Yeah, there you go. And that kind of awareness that where it's cheap, it's nourishing. It may not be fashionable, but who cares? That attitude is actually, the people who can embrace it and can follow through on it are actually going to do much better than the people who are clinging to the fashionable habits. Wealth has bankrupted them.
To tie a few threads together here, we have this what we began with, this abstract quote unquote economy. We have the fact it is backed on fossil fuels, a limited resource. You can't have infinite growth on a finite planet, and yet the economy and economics generally, I think, unconsciously pushes the idea that there is such a thing, or there can be such a thing if we were just to follow them. We also have the third part, which is consumer society. So to tie them all together, it seems to be that economics basically wants to avoid the fact that consumption is one of the key problems going into our future, and that there can be found some miraculous way where the entire world, specifically Western, can eat its cake and have it too.
Oh yeah. That's one of the ways where you can tell that economists live in la la land. because so many of them are convinced that if we only have enough money, we can have enough goods and services. I mean that quite literally. Back during the last round of peak oil concern, the next one will be we're a couple of years out probably, but back during the last round, you'd see articles in the financial press where people were saying, "Look, this is stupid. As long as we invest enough money in discovering new oil reserves, we'll have plenty of oil." And they're saying that with a straight face, as though brandishing about wads of dollar bills could somehow conjure oil into being in the depths of the earth. And I'm going, look, I practice ceremonial magic, and I know that's stupid. You claim to be a rationalist, and you're engaging in this weird, superstitious behavior. What is wrong here?
I like the idea of a sort of a panicked investor stood by an oil well, literally throwing money at scientists, saying, do something, because ultimately the logic, I guess the logic that would follow would be, if we invest more money into oil technologies, we can develop something which can extract more, is able to extract that lower oil and extract more, etc., etc. Now, on paper, that is that's great. However, as we both know, just because you throw a load of money at something, at an idea, here's develop a piece of technology that can get, the dregs of this oil out and do it at a better energy rate than, let's say 2 to 1 or whatever. Just because you give them £1 billion doesn't mean it's going to happen.
Doesn't mean it's going to happen. And especially when you have these awkward little things like the laws of thermodynamics breathing down your neck saying, And that's the situation we're in. We're kind of in the diminuendo days of the fracking debacle here in the United States. The fracking industry is doing okay at the moment because it's basically stopped developing new sites, so they don't have the outgo. So they're making money off their existing stuff. It's become very clear that it's not an answer. It's a temporary stopgap, and it's a temporary stopgap that doesn't pay for itself because the costs are so high in terms of energy. The net energy returns are sufficiently low. The production costs in money or energy are too high, and it's just, you can prop it up through political and economic gamesmanship for a while, but it's not a solution. And so that's winding down at this point. And as that happens, expect to hear blood-curdling cries from all of the cornucopian types who are convinced that this or that or the other will prevent us from, running out of oil, even though we're burning 100 million barrels a day or whatever it is.
So, what's the current? I haven't really kept up with it lately. What's the current sort of status of peak oil generally?
Okay, we would have probably been in an oil crisis by now, except for the coronavirus panic, which drove consumption down very sharply and dropped the price a bit. Right now, the benchmark varieties of oil are in the low $70 a barrel range. Brent is, I think, at 73 this morning, 73 and change. West Texas Intermediate was around 71 and change. Those of our listeners who were listening during the last peak oil spike will remember the blood-curdling insistence that if the price of oil ever got above $50 a barrel, that would mean the end of the global economy. Obviously, that didn't happen, but it is not a good sign, because what this means is, again, the price of oil has been driven upwards due to declining supply and unyielding demand. So what I expect to see is that over the next year or so, there will be the usual fluctuations up and down, but more up than down. And so the price will begin climbing a little further, and then it'll start to take jumps upwards, and people will panic. And there will be lots of loud news media about the crisis in oil. We will hear all of the pro-nuclear types will come out with their quack nostrum, insisting, yes, you need to throw billions of dollars into new nuclear power plants, despite the fact that no previous nuclear power plant has ever been able to pay for itself. And the green energy advocates will say you need to throw trillions of dollars into green energy, even though you're buying problems with intermittency and the natural resources needed to build current green technologies are just amazingly high. And price of oil will spike, it will crash, it will bounce up again, it will wobble a ways, and probably stabilize somewhere around $100 a barrel. and we'll all get used to using a chunk less energy or spending much more money for it until the next crisis hits.
Mm. I mean, that was one of the amazing things from the pandemic and all the lockdowns is the amount of, and it's sort of absurdly humorous, is the amount of companies that did transition to purely online work, which was blindingly obvious for the last probably 10 years. And yet, when the pandemic and all the lockdowns have been let up, most people, even though a lot of people were saying, oh yeah, we loved, blah, 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 doing this type of work, most people just got up and sauntered back to the office.
Exactly. Exactly, yeah. And the thing is, companies could save millions.
You could literally not have property.
An office. Exactly. Yeah, you could say you no longer have a skyscraper to maintain. You could save immense amount of money, but since human beings are social primates, and the big baboons in the corner office want to have those displays of dominance and so on, and there are various other things. Yeah, they're just going right back to the business as usual. We'll see how long that lasts.
Mm-hmm. No, that's what I was going to say. All these reports of celebrities or big businessmen taking a flight somewhere for a call, and you think, it's just status, and you're not going to talk anyone out of that.
Mm-hmm. No, it's going to take either really, really drastic shifts in the economy or in politics, because as we saw with during the virus panic, we can eliminate private tourist air travel.
Mm-hmm.
That could go away tomorrow, and we'd save that right there would cut an incredibly huge amount of carbon out of the atmosphere. You want to get us, heading toward balance? That's a great way to do it. Try talking people into it. Similarly, we could eliminate commuting. In most cases, probably about half the commuters could be just all the office workers could simply stay home. There again, we've annihilated this immense quantity of carbon that's being dumped to the atmosphere, but even when you point out, well, aren't you concerned about global warming? It's been one of the points that I made over and over again, that you find an enormous number of people who are perfectly willing to emote by the hour about global warming, but don't you dare ask them
to do it.
To give up their SUV, or to give up flying to the other side of the planet for their next ecotourism vacation. Yeah, no, they've got to have their status symbols, even if it wrecks the planet. And so this is why, although I'm very well aware of the reality of global warming, I'm somewhat sympathetic to the people on the other side of the political spectrum, because they're saying, look, if this was real, you'd be taking it seriously, and you're not. And so, looking at that, this cycles kind of back to the whole issue with the managerial class being totally baffled that people don't believe them. Mm-hmm. Because here again, we have people who are refusing to live according to their beliefs, and then wonder why people don't think they take the beliefs seriously.
I think it's because a lot of their beliefs are built off sort of illusory impressions of what that belief actually is, sort of as a vision. So you know what I mean? So when you think of saving the planet, stopping climate change, you think, veganism, and going to these places and saving the rainforest, and et cetera, these things we've mentioned. But actually, the truth of the matter is much more banal. It's staying local. It's not eating a vegan diet, because they're not sustainable in most places in the world.
Exactly.
It's not going on holiday, and it's not driving, and it's also not purchasing a load of stuff. And it's like, you don't get to have all those things and not destroy the planet. That's not possible.
Exactly. No, you. Given that the wealthiest 10% of people in the world today produce 50% of the greenhouse gases, there's a very simple way that any well-to-do person can have a hugely oversized impact on the environmental problem. Live as though they're poor. Mm-hmm. That's all it takes. And again, you've done it, I've done it. We know that it's perfectly possible to live a comfortable, decent, humane life on much less money than most people spend. But try talking to people, again, whose identity is caught up in being the special people.
Well, I think this is one of the things, and if this was said on a sort of a news show in the UK or in the US, I would be scolded for it. But I have been,
of course,
I've been there where, as you said, you're budgeting for meals, you're budgeting for food and for shelter, right?
Mm-hmm,
so
mm-hmm.
I can sort of say from my own experience and from people I've seen that a lot of people extend their poverty because they buy into an ideal, which just simply, if you don't have to stretch for these things. And so a lot of people end up becoming poor because they go a little bit up the ladder and now think, well, I need to have this, and this now.
Yeah, and of course that's a very important thing. Because they're caught up in the image, just like the environmentalists we were talking about, who are caught up in the image of saving the rainforest, saving the planet, and it's all the image, and not the reality. In the same way, you have people who, I've climbed the ladder. I'm not like those people who I used to be. Therefore, I've got to buy this. I've got to buy that. I've got to buy the other thing, even if that means that I have less free money to spend than the people I claim I despise.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So the big question, economically speaking, what is to be done? Do you think?
Well, here again, the first the thing that the rock on which most of these questions break is individual choice. You cannot save the planet unless you're willing to change your own lifestyle. Equally, you cannot make for a sane economy unless you're willing to change your own lifestyle, unless you're willing to change how you relate to the economic world. And at this point, with the economy being as toxic and as booby-trapped, frankly, as it is, the major factor there is detaching as much of your life from the economic realm as you can. You do not have to spend money. There's a lot of things where people go out of their way to spend money because they've been taught that's how you do X. How you have fun always amounts to spending lots of money, sometimes obscene, absurd, preposterous amounts of money. And then you're sitting there going, I'm having fun. I'm going to convince myself that I'm having fun because I spent all that money having fun. There's a lot of that. So take your habits of having fun and say, okay, what can I do without spending one penny? Mm-hmm. Because there's a lot. And look at other things that you have other needs. How many of them can you fill without spending a penny? How many of them can you meet spending a lot less money than you do? Walking back your participation in the consumer economy is a truly revolutionary act at this point, because it's by your entrapment in that economy that you're running on that endless hamster wheel, never getting anywhere, but exhausting yourself. Walk back, step back, in terms that I used in a slightly different context, collapse now and avoid the rush. Very likely, most of us are going to be a lot poorer in the years ahead because we're moving into a series of economic crises that are very likely to reduce standards of living worldwide, and especially in the United States, in the English-speaking world generally. A lot of us are going to be poor. Go there first. Learn how to do it. Decrease your outgo before you have to, so you can provide yourself with the tools and the skills and the knowledge you need to do it in a graceful and effective way, and you can thrive. And so that's one of the basic rules that I'm recommending to people here. Just back away a little bit from the consumer economy. Beyond that, it's really going to take a certain critical mass of people who are willing to look at the situation and look at the economy and look at the problems with the way things are being done these days before any change can happen on a collective level. That can start by people educating themselves and helping other people to educate themselves. But it's going to be a while before there are enough people, I think, who are willing to grasp the fact that they're basically in a rigged casino. And that just getting hired by the management is not actually going to change the situation.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Is there anything you'd like to add about the wealth of nature?
When I reviewed it, in order to do the revision just a little while ago for the new edition that'll be out shortly. I was really pleased. I thought that it really did address the situation that we're in very well for a book that's 10 years old now. Mm-hmm. It anticipated a lot of things that were going to happen, and its analysis still, I think, works fairly well. I was hoping it would have more of an impact than it did. I was hoping that more people would read it, that it would spark more discussion. It got a certain amount of that, but of course not from economists.
So, quite a few books are being re-released soon. Also, are you working on anything new?
Oh, always. I haven't been doing much in the Future of Industrial Society range of things. I wrote 10 books on that subject during the last peak oil spike, and that kind of covered most of the ground, starting with the long descent and ending with the retro future. I don't know that I had at that point much more to say. At this point, I'm going to be writing some more on my blog and so on about the current state of climate change and some things like that, because that's picking up. But I've got a new book on Druidry coming out early in the year. In terms of books that are being reprinted, there's The Wealth of Nature. The Ecotechnic Future is about to be out. It would have been out a little while ago, except there were some delays. Yet another round of shortages. We've all heard that. Also, The Retro Future and After Progress, two of my other books from the peak oil years, are going to be coming out. I haven't started revising them yet because they won't be available for reprinting until October. But those are on the agenda. Let's see, what else? My book Monsters, which is actually my best-selling book so far of all time, is coming out with a third edition. That'll be out this fall. And other than that, we'll see.
Okay. That's very good.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks very much for coming on.
Thank you for having me.